The fluorescent lights of the exam room hummed with the clinical indifference that set Clara James's nerves on edge. At 65, Clara knew her body like an old, well-loved hymnal. She knew the rhythmic ache in her knees when rain was coming to Atlanta, the way her skin had softened into a roadmap of a life well lived, and the specific, stubborn exhaustion that had settled into her bones over the last month. "It's just a transition, Dr. Aries," Clara said, smoothing the floral fabric of her Sunday dress. She'd come straight from a charity committee meeting. "My iron is probably low again, or perhaps my body is finally realizing I've been retired from teaching for a decade and decided to catch up on all that missed sleep." Dr. Aris didn't look up from the chart. He was a man who had delivered half the babies in this zip code, usually a fountain of bad jokes and warm reassurance. Today, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Clara," he started, his voice uncharacteristically thin, "I've known you since you were 40. I know your medical history. I know you went through menopause 15 years ago." "Exactly," Clara chuckled, though the sound felt tight in her throat. "So, give me the vitamins and let me get home. I have a dinner date tonight." The thought of Guan flashed through her mind. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. The quiet, respectful way he'd held her hand at the botanical gardens 3 months ago. He was 40, a businessman on an extended stay from Seoul, and he treated her like she was made of fine silk. He made her feel young, but she wasn't delusional. She was a realist. Dr. Aris finally looked at her. He set the clipboard down with a deliberate clack. "I ran the panel 3 times, Clara. I sent it to 2 different labs because I thought my equipment was failing. I even pulled the backup samples." He leaned forward, his face a mask of professional disbelief, warring with personal awe. "The fatigue isn't anemia. Your HCG levels are skyrocketing." Clara frowned, her brow furrowing. "I don't know what those letters mean, Dr. Aries." "Speak English." "Clara, you're pregnant." The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt structural. Clara didn't gasp. She didn't faint. She simply stared at a small poster on the wall detailing the food pyramid. "Doctor," she said, her voice dropping into the low, steady register she used to use to quiet a rowdy classroom. "I am 65 years old. My womb is a closed chapter. It's been out of commission since the Clinton administration." "I know," Aris whispered, shaking his head. "Biologically, it's a non-starter. Medically, it's a freak occurrence. But the blood doesn't lie. You're 6 weeks along." Clara's hand instinctively drifted to her abdomen. It felt the same. A little soft, a little rounder than it was 20 years ago. But suddenly, it felt like holy ground. She thought of her mother's voice, a woman of deep, unshakable faith, who used to say that the Creator didn't much care for the impossible labels humans slapped on things. "God doesn't check birth certificates, Clara." She could almost hear her mother whisper. Is it safe?" Clara asked, her voice finally trembling. "We're in uncharted territory," Aris admitted. "But right now, the vitals are perfect. It's a miracle, Clara. There's no other word for it." Clara looked out the window at the Georgia pines, her mind racing to Guan. He was younger, yes, but he was a man of tradition, of family. He was just a businessman with a kind heart and a mysterious depth. How was she supposed to tell a man in the prime of his life that he just defied every law of nature with the woman who was supposed to be settling into her twilight years. She wasn't just a retired teacher anymore. She was a vessel for something impossible. The walk back to her small, sun-drenched cottage in the historic district felt like moving through a dream or a fever. Clara's hand stayed pressed against her stomach, a protective shield against a world that didn't yet know it had broken its own rules. As she began to get ready for her dinner date, her eyes caught the framed invitation on her vanity, a relic from 6 months ago, the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra Charity Gala. She hadn't wanted to go. At 65, she'd had enough rubber chicken dinners to last a lifetime, but her best friend had insisted, and Clara had stepped out in a midnight blue silk wrap that made her skin glow like polished mahogany. That was the night she met Guan Jin Kim. He hadn't looked like a shark or a titan of industry. He'd been standing alone by the balcony, nursing a sparkling water, looking slightly overwhelmed by the southern drawls and the clinking of heavy jewelry. He was 40, with sharp, clean features and eyes that seemed to carry a weary wisdom. When their eyes met, the 25-year gap between them didn't just shrink, it vanished. "You look like you're plotting an escape," she'd said, her voice a warm alto that had made him turn with a startled, genuine smile. "I am," he'd confessed, his English formal and precise, accented with the rhythmic lilt of soul. "The air in here is very expensive. It is hard to breathe." They had spent the rest of the night talking, not about portfolios or politics, but about the quiet things. He told her he was a businessman, overseeing some local logistics for his family's firm. He spoke of his love for old architecture and the way the Georgia humidity reminded him of certain summers in Busan. Clara spoke of her 30 years in the classroom, the children she'd raised as if they were her own, and the peaceful solitude of her garden. Their romance had been a slow, steady burn. He was a man of small things. He didn't bring her flashy diamonds. He brought her rare heirloom seeds for her garden. He didn't take her to the loudest clubs. They spent rainy Tuesday afternoon at the High Museum, standing in front of Rothko paintings in comfortable silence. Once, while they were sharing a quiet meal of bulgogi she'd learned to make from a YouTube video, he had reached across the table and taken her hand. His skin was smooth, his grip firm. "Clara," he had whispered, his thumb tracing the fine lines on her knuckles. "In my country, we respect the passage of time. But with you, I do not see years. I see a soul that matches mine. You are my peace." She had felt a flutter in her chest then, a youthful, terrifying spark she thought had died out with her late husband a decade ago. She had worried about the optics, of course. A black woman of a certain age with a younger Asian man? The whispers at the grocery store were already starting. But Guan never flinched. He walked beside her with a quiet, leonine pride that made the rest of the world feel small. Now, standing in front of her mirror, Clara stared at her reflection. She looked the same, the silver at her temples, the soft curves, but everything had changed. He was coming over in an hour. He would bring flowers. He would kiss her cheek and ask about her day. And she would have to look into those deep, honest eyes and tell him that just a businessman and a retired teacher were about to become a medical impossibility. She didn't call to tell him. How could she? The secret felt like a bird trapped in her chest, beating its wings against her ribs. She was terrified that this miracle would be the thing that finally made him realize she belonged to a different generation, that the reality of a child would shatter the beautiful, quiet bubble they had built. God's plan, she whispered to the empty room, her voice cracking. You sure picked a complicated time for a miracle. She smoothed her dress, checked the stove, and waited for the knock on the door that would change their lives forever. The knock at the door was rhythmic and familiar, 3 precise raps that always made Clara's heart do a youthful flutter. She had no business feeling at 65. She took one last look in the hallway mirror. Her skin was glowing, a side effect of the miracle that Dr. Aries hadn't warned her about. She looked vibrant, yet her hands trembled as she turned the brass knob. Guan stood on her porch, framed by the amber glow of the Atlanta sunset. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him with an effortless, understated elegance. In his hand was a bouquet of white peonies, her favorite. Clara, he breathed, his eyes traveling over her face with a devotion that always felt like a warm blanket. You look radiant. Is that a new dress? Just an old favorite, Guan, she lied, her voice slightly breathless. It's not the dress, honey. It's the stowaway, she thought, the secret burning a hole in her tongue. He stepped inside, the scent of his cologne mingling with the jasmine from her garden. Usually, they would settle into the sofa with tea. But tonight, Guan seemed possessed by a restless energy. He didn't sit. Instead, he took both of her hands in his. I have something to ask of you, he began, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. My family is hosting a centennial celebration for our foundation in Seoul. It is a very significant event. My mother expects me to be there. Clara felt a cold prickle of apprehension. In 6 months, he had spoken very little of his mother, other than to imply she was a woman of firm traditions. Seoul is a long way for a retired school teacher, Guan, Clara said softly, testing the waters. And your mother? Does she know about us? A shadow flickered across his handsome features, gone as quickly as it appeared. She knows I have found someone who makes me happy, but she is a woman who needs to see things to believe them. I want you by my side, Clara. I want the world to see you. Clara's hand instinctively moved toward her stomach, catching herself just in time to smooth her skirt. The timing was terrifying. She was 65, carrying a child that shouldn't exist, and now she was being asked to fly across the world to meet a matriarch who likely expected a daughter-in-law 20 years younger and of a different pedigree. Tell him now, her inner voice urged. Tell him before the plane tickets are booked. But she looked at the hope in his eyes, the way he looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world. And her courage failed. If she told him now, would he still want her to go? Or would he see her as a medical liability, a complication to be managed? I'll go, she whispered. He pulled her into a hug, his face buried in the crook of her neck. Thank you. You don't know what this means to me, to our future. Our future, Clara thought, her eyes stinging. You have no idea how big that future just got. She resolved then she would tell him in Seoul. She would find a quiet moment, away from the prying eyes of his logistics business, and reveal the miracle. She would face his mother, face the long flight, and face the impossible. After all, if God could jumpstart a womb that had been dormant for 15 years, surely he could handle a trip to South Korea. The descent into Incheon International Airport felt like a fall from grace. Clara watched the jagged, neon-lit silhouette of Seoul rise up to meet the wing of the plane, her hand resting protectively over the slight, impossible flutter in her abdomen. She had practiced her confession 1,000 times during the 14-hour flight. Guan, I'm not just a woman of a certain age anymore. I'm a mother-to-be. But as she stepped through the jet bridge, the air changed. It wasn't the humid, welcoming embrace of Georgia. It was sharp, sterilized, and smelled of ozone and expensive filtration. She scanned the crowd for Guan's warm smile and his charcoal suit. Instead, she found a wall of black fabric. 4 men, built like granite pillars with translucent earpieces, stood in a phalanx. They didn't carry flowers. One held a tablet with her name, Clara James. "Where is Guan?" she asked, her southern lilt sounding small against the polished marble of the terminal. "Director Kim is occupied with the board," the lead man replied. His English was perfect, his expression non-existent. "We are to escort you to the secondary residence. Please, this way." They didn't ask for her bags. They commanded them. Clara felt less like a guest and more like a package being intercepted by customs. She was ushered into a black sedan with windows so darkly tinted, the vibrant world of Seoul turned into a gray ghost land. They didn't drive to a neighborhood. They drove to a fortress of glass and steel that pierced the clouds, the Jin Kim International Tower. "This isn't a home," Clara whispered as the elevator hummed, ascending floors with a speed that made her morning sickness flare in her throat. "This is the corporate suite," the guard replied as the door slid open. The suite was a cathedral of cold minimalism. White marble floors, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Han River, and furniture that looked more like modern art than something meant for a human body. There were no family photos, no warmth, no smell of cooking. Clara stood in the center of the room, her sensible travel loafers looking out of place on the stone. She walked to the window and looked down. The logos were everywhere. On the buildings, the trucks, the digital billboards flashing in the distance, the JK insignia. Her breath hitched. She had seen that logo on the shipping containers in Savannah. She had seen it on the side of the hospital in Atlanta. "Logistics," she murmured, a bitter realization settling in her chest. He said he worked in logistics. He didn't work in logistics. He owned the logistics. He owned the ships, the ports, and seemingly half the skyline she was staring at. Her humble businessman was a prince of an empire she couldn't even map. She wasn't just a retired teacher in a foreign land. She was a woman carrying the heir to a multi-billion-dollar dynasty, standing in a glass cage built by a man she realized she didn't fully know. A soft chime sounded. The heavy oak doors at the end of the hall swung open. A woman stepped out, draped in a hanbok of stiff silver silk that looked like armor. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen her eyes into obsidian blades. This wasn't a welcoming committee. This was an interrogation. "So," the woman said, her voice like the snap of a winter branch, "the American curiosity has arrived." Clara straightened her shoulders, drawing on every ounce of dignity her mother had gifted her. "I'm Clara James," she said firmly. The woman moved across the marble floor with the silent, predatory grace of a winter leopard. She didn't offer a hand, nor did she bow. She simply stopped 3 feet from Clara, her gaze traveling downward from Clara's silver-threaded hair to her sensible walking shoes with a look of profound, clinical distaste. "I am Madam Kim," the woman said. Her English was flawless, stripped of any warmth, seasoned only with the bitterness of a long-held grudge. "But you likely knew that. You have spent 6 months researching the architecture of my son's life, haven't you?" "I spent 6 months getting to know a man named Guan," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline hammering in her chest. Madam Kim let out a short, sharp sound. A laugh that hadn't seen the sun in decades. She walked to a desk of polished obsidian and picked up a slip of paper. She didn't walk back. She tossed it. The paper fluttered through the air, landing on the cold glass coffee table between them. $10 million, Madam Kim said, gesturing to the check with a flick of her wrist. "American, tax-free. I've already instructed my legal team to handle the wire transfer details once you sign the non-disclosure agreement." Clara didn't look down at the check. She kept her eyes locked on the woman who looked like she'd been carved out of ice. "And what exactly are you buying with $10 million? "Your departure," Madam Kim snapped. "You are a 65-year-old distraction, Miss James. You are a biological dead end. My son is the chairman of a global empire that requires an image of strength, vitality, and continuity. You represent a midlife crisis that has overstayed its welcome." Clara felt the heat rising in her neck, but she didn't let it reach her face. She thought of the tiny life currently knitting itself together inside her. The air this woman didn't believe was possible. "Guan told me he wanted me here," Clara said. "Guan is a man of honor, which makes him susceptible to sentimentality," Madam Kim countered, stepping closer. The scent of her perfume was expensive and suffocating. "He feels a sense of duty to you because you provided him a brief respite from his reality. But look at yourself. Look at this room. You are a retired school teacher from the American South. You are out of your depth." Madam Kim leaned in, her voice dropping to a hiss. "Take the money. Go back to your garden and your rocking chair. Buy yourself a quiet life and forget you ever stepped foot in Seoul. If you stay, I will make sure the world sees you as the delusional predator you are." The room felt smaller. Clara realized she wasn't just fighting for a relationship. She was in a war for her dignity and the future of a child that Madam Kim would undoubtedly view as a threat to her bloodline. Clara looked at the check. $10 million. It was enough to change the lives of every student she'd ever taught. It was enough to build a new wing on her church. Then she looked back at Madam Kim. "You know, back home, we have a saying," Clara said, her southern drawl thickening, becoming a velvet weapon. "Money can buy a lot of things, Madam Kim, but it can't buy a soul, and it sure as hell can't buy me." The obsidian desk reflected the overhead lights like a frozen lake, and the check lay between them, a piece of paper worth a fortune, yet feeling like a piece of trash in the air between two women. Clara didn't reach for it. Instead, she straightened her spine, her shoulders squaring with the quiet authority of a woman who had stood her ground against school boards, city councils, and the slow march of time itself. "I think you've mistaken me for someone who has a price," Clara said, her voice dropping into a low, resonant hum. "I've lived 65 years without your millions, Madam Kim. I don't see why I'd start needing them now." Madam Kim's face, which had been a mask of porcelain perfection, suddenly contorted. The composure didn't just crack, it disintegrated. She took a step forward, the silk of her hanbok hissing against the marble. "You think this is a romantic film?" The matriarch spat, the words jagged and ugly. "You think you can waltz into our history and plant your flag? You are a delusion, a biological impossibility. My son is a king. He is the Jin Kim legacy. He needs a partner who can build that future. He needs a womb, not a relic." She stepped into Clara's personal space, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure, unadulterated vitriol. "Look at yourself," Madam Kim hissed, her voice trembling with a deep-seated systemic hate. "The board is already laughing. The shareholders will think he's lost his mind. My son could have any socialite in Seoul. Women with a lineage, women with skin like milk, women who aren't. You." She leaned in, her breath cold against Clara's cheek, delivering the words like a physical blow. "You are too old, too dark, and too common to ever walk through these doors as anything more than a paid mistake. You are a stain on a 500-year-old bloodline. Go home, Clara James, before I ensure you have nothing left to go home to." The air in the room seemed to vanish. The insult was so calculated, so rooted in a specific brand of cruelty, that it should have crushed Clara. It was the kind of comment designed to make a woman feel invisible, to remind her of every door that had ever been slammed in her face because of the year on her ID or the pigment in her skin. But Clara didn't flinch. Inside her, the medical miracle felt like a spark of heat. She felt the weight of her ancestors behind her, women who had survived much worse than a bitter woman in a silver dress. For a moment, the only sound in the cavernous, cold suite was the hum of the climate control and the frantic, shallow breathing of a woman whose hatred had finally exhausted her vocabulary. Clara stood her ground. She felt every one of her 65 years, but they didn't feel like a burden. They felt like armor. Every gray hair was a battle won. Every line on her face was a story of survival. She looked down at the slip of paper on the obsidian table. The $10 million tether Madam Kim thought would drag her back across the Atlantic. With a deliberate, agonizing slowness, Clara reached down. Madam Kim's eyes followed the movement, a flicker of triumphant greed crossing her face. She expected Clara to fold. She expected the common woman to succumb to the weight of the zeros. Clara's fingers closed around the cool, crisp edge of the check. She lifted it, holding it up between them like a specimen. $10 million, Clara murmured, her voice like velvet over gravel. In Atlanta, this could buy a mansion on a hill. It could buy a fleet of cars. It could even buy silence from a woman who didn't know her own worth. Then Clara's grip tightened. Rip! The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in the sterile room. Madam Kim's jaw dropped. Rip! Clara tore the paper again, her movements rhythmic and calm, as if she were shucking corn on a Sunday afternoon. She folded the pieces and tore them again and again, until the multi-million-dollar fortune was nothing more than a handful of white confetti. I've spent 40 years teaching children that the most precious things in this world can't be put in a bank account, Clara said, her eyes boring into Madam Kim's obsidian stare. You think you're insulted by my age? My skin? That's nothing compared to how insulted I am by your math. You think my heart and the life Guan and I have built is worth a down payment on a cargo ship? Clara opened her hand. She didn't drop the scraps. She let them flutter, a miniature snowstorm of corporate arrogance falling onto the pristine marble floor. I'm not here for your money, Madam Kim. I don't need your permission to exist, and I certainly don't need your blessing to be loved. Clara took a step forward, forcing the smaller woman to instinctively retreat. The power dynamic in the room had flipped. The billionaire's mother was shrinking, and the retired teacher was a giant. I am not leaving my man, Clara whispered, her voice a promise and a threat. And I am not leaving this city until he tells me to. You can send your lawyers, you can send your guards, but you've lived in this glass tower so long you've forgotten what a real woman looks like. I'm Clara James, and I'm just getting started. Clara turned her back on the matriarch, leaving the confetti scattered like bone dust on the floor. She walked toward the elevator, her hand resting firmly, victoriously over her womb. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive chime, and Clara stepped out into the humid evening air of Seoul. Her knees felt like water, but her spine remained a rod of iron. Behind her, in the glass tower, she had left a fortune in scraps on the floor. Ahead of her was a city she didn't know, in a life that had suddenly become a stranger to her. She barely had time to catch her breath before the street erupted. A phalanx of black sedans, polished to such a high gloss they looked like obsidian mirrors, rounded the corner in a synchronized ballet of power. There were 20 of them, a motorcade fit for a head of state. Blue and red lights flickered discreetly behind the grills. Pedestrians stopped and stared, hushed and respectful, as the lead vehicle pulled to a halt exactly at the curb where Clara stood. The rear door opened before the car had fully stopped. Guan stepped out. But this wasn't the man from the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. Gone was the soft linen shirt and the easy, approachable smile. He was clad in a bespoke suit, his jaw set in a hard royal line. 4 men in earpieces flanked him instantly, clearing a path through a crowd that hadn't even gathered yet. "Clara!" he called out, his voice cutting through the city noise with an authority she'd never heard him use. He reached for her, his eyes searching hers for damage. "My mother? She intercepted you. I was in the board meeting. I didn't know she had sent her private security." Clara stepped back, her hand held up like a stop sign. The warmth she usually felt when she saw him was being suffocated by a cold, rising fury. "Who are you, Guan?" she asked. Her voice wasn't loud, but it stopped him in his tracks. "Clara, let's get in the car. We can talk in private," he urged, reaching again. "I said, who are you?" she repeated, gesturing to the fleet of armored cars, the bowing security guards, and the glowing JK logo atop the skyscraper behind them. "Because the man I spent 6 months with in Georgia told me he was a businessman. He told me he liked heirloom tomatoes and jazz. He didn't tell me he owned the Skyline. He didn't tell me his mother was a dragon who keeps $10 million checks in her pocket to pay off the trash her son brings home." Guan winced as if she struck him. "It's complicated, Clara. My family name, it's a burden. I wanted you to love me, not the empire. I was going to tell you tonight, at dinner." "Tonight?" Clara's laugh was sharp and jagged. "I had to fly 7,000 miles to be insulted, belittled, and called a relic before I found out the man I'm carrying a child for is a prince of industry. Why did I have to find out from your hateful mother that I was too old and too dark for your world. The word child hung in the air like a lightning strike. The security guard shifted. The motorcade seemed to hum. Guan froze, his face draining of color as his gaze dropped to her midsection, then back to her eyes. The secret identity layer hadn't just peeled back. It had been stripped raw. Clara, he whispered, the CEO mask finally shattering. What did you just say? I said I'm carrying your heir, Guan, she said, her eyes flashing with a righteous fire. And right now, I'm wondering if his father is the man I loved in Atlanta or the stranger standing in front of this motorcade. The interior of the lead sedan was a sanctuary of hushed leather and climate-controlled stillness, a stark contrast to the neon chaos of the Seoul streets. As the door thudded shut, sealing them away from the prying eyes of the security detail and the flashing digital billboards of the Jin Kim empire, the silence became a living thing. Guan didn't sit behind the small mahogany desk built into the console. He sat on the bench beside Clara, his knees nearly touching hers. The CEO had vanished. In his place was a man who looked like he had forgotten how to breathe. Clara, he whispered, his voice cracking, repeat what you said, on the street, please. Clara looked at him, her anger still simmering, but beginning to mix with a profound, weary vulnerability. She took his hand, the hand of the man she had loved in Atlanta, and placed it firmly against her abdomen. Beneath the silk of her dress and the layers of her own disbelief, there was a steady, quiet heat. I'm 65 years old, Guan, she began, her voice trembling. I went to the doctor for a checkup because I was tired. I thought it was my age catching up to me. I thought the sun was finally setting on my body. She took a jagged breath. But the tests, 3 of them, they all said the same thing. I'm 6 weeks pregnant. With your child. Guan's hand flinched beneath hers, not in recoil, but as if he'd been struck by an electric current. He stared at his own palm against her stomach, his dark eyes wide and shimmering with a sudden, overwhelming moisture. A child, he breathed. A miracle. My mother. She has spent 20 years telling me I must marry a woman of her choosing to secure an heir. She treated my life like a balance sheet. And all this time, he looked up at Clara, and the devotion in his eyes was so fierce it was almost frightening. It was you. It was always you. Your mother called me a relic, Guan, Clara said, the sting of the insult returning. She told me I was a biological dead end. She told me I was too dark and too old to be anything more than a mistake you made in America. The transformation in Guan was instantaneous. The soft wonder in his eyes hardened into a cold, terrifying resolve. He didn't just look like a billionaire. He looked like a king preparing for a crusade. He took her face in both of his hands, his thumb stroking her cheekbones. My mother is a woman who thinks she can control the tides because she owns the ships, he hissed, his voice vibrating with a protective fury. She has no idea what she has just done. She didn't just insult a foreigner, Clara. She insulted the mother of the chairman. She insulted the woman who holds my soul in her hands. He leaned forward until their foreheads touched, his breath warm against her skin. This is our miracle, he vowed. This baby. This is my heir. And you are my wife in every way that matters. If my mother thinks she can use her money or her board of directors to touch you, she is mistaken. I will strip her of every title. I will dismantle every stone of this company. I will burn this city to the ground before I let them cast a shadow over you or our child. He pulled her into his chest, holding her with a desperate strength. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the power of the man and the empire, shifting to stand behind her. We aren't going to a hotel, Clara, Guan said. pulling back to look at her. "We are going to the family estate. You will walk through the front doors, and you will walk through them as the future matriarch of the Jin Kim family." The Shilla Hotel ballroom was a cavern of gold leaf, crystal chandeliers, and the suffocating scent of lilies, Madame Kim's favorite flower. It was a room designed to make anyone who wasn't born into old money feel small. And as Clara entered on Guan's arm, she felt the collective intake of breath from 300 of Seoul's elite. She wore a gown of burnt orange velvet that complemented the richness of her skin, her silver strand hair styled into a regal crown. Beside her, Guan was a pillar of granite, his hand never leaving the small of her back. But the whispers started before they reached the first table. "Is that her?" a woman hissed behind a silk fan. "The American grandmother?" Then the crowd parted like a dark sea for Min-hee. At 35, she was the crown jewel of the Choi shipping dynasty, the woman Madame Kim had groomed to be Guan's wife. She was dressed in a sheer, diamond-encrusted gown that clung to her rail-thin frame like a second skin. Her face was a triumph of surgical perfection. Smooth, pale, and utterly devoid of the character that comes from actually living a life. Min-hee didn't bow. She glided toward them, a champagne flute held between manicured fingers like a weapon. "Guan Appa," Min-hee purred, her voice a sugary poison. She didn't even look at Clara at first. "Your mother told me you were bringing a guest, but I assumed she meant a consultant. Or perhaps a nanny?" Guan's grip on Clara's waist tightened, his jaw muscle leaping. "Min-hee, mind your tongue. This is Clara James. She is the woman I love." Min-hee finally turned her gaze toward Clara. She looked her up and down with a slow, theatrical pity that made the surrounding socialites titter. She leaned in, her perfume cloying and sharp, and lowered her voice just enough so the nearby tables could hear every word. "You have a lovely grace, Mrs. James," Min-hee whispered, her eyes flashing with a cruel, youthful arrogance. "But surely you realize where you are. This isn't a retirement home in Georgia. It's a dynasty. Look at your skin. Look at your hands. You don't belong at this ballroom. You look like you've come to collect Guan from preschool, not to stand by his side as an equal." She took a delicate sip of her champagne, her smile widening into a sneer. "Tell me, does he help you up the stairs? Or do you just remind him of the grandmother he lost too soon? It's a bit morbid, don't you think, Guan? Bringing a museum piece to a celebration of the future?" The rage engine in the room roared to life. Clara felt the sting of the words, the classic sharp jab at her age and her presence. But she didn't look away. She thought of the life growing inside her, a life that Min-hee would never carry. She thought of the 40 years she'd spent molding minds, while this woman was likely molding clay in a finishing school. Clara took a step forward, closing the gap until she was inches from Min-hee's perfect frozen face. "Honey," Clara said, her voice a low, honeyed drawl that carried the weight of a century. "I've forgotten more about being a woman than you've had time to learn. You're worried about my skin and my years. I look in the mirror and I see a life well lived. You look in the mirror and you see a woman who's terrified of a wrinkle." Clara leaned in closer, her eyes flashing like tempered steel. "And as for the future," Clara whispered, loud enough for Madame Kim, who was watching from the dais, to see the movement of her lips. "The future isn't in your diamond dress. It's right here. And trust me, child, you aren't even in the prologue." Clara turned to Guan, her head held high. "I think I'd like a glass of water, darling. The air in here is a bit thin." The morning in Seoul didn't break with the sun. It broke with the rhythmic, aggressive vibration of Clara's phone on the marble nightstand. When she sat up, the room felt cold. The medical miracle was making its presence known with a wave of nausea, but the true sickness came when she saw the screen. Guan had already left for a dawn meeting with the board, but he had left his tablet behind. The notifications were a digital avalanche. Madam Kim hadn't used a checkbook this time. She had used a scalpel. By 8 a.m., every major tabloid in South Korea and every gossip blog from Seoul to Atlanta had the story. The headline on the Seoul Daily was accompanied by a grainy, zoomed-in photo of Clara leaving Dr. Aris's clinic in Georgia, followed by a leaked scan of her ultrasound. The elderly foreigner entrapping our prince, the 65-year-old miracle, or a corporate con. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It didn't just question the pregnancy, it weaponized Clara's very existence. They called her a social climber of advanced years, a biological anomaly being used as a ransom note, and hinted that the pregnancy was a high-tech fraud orchestrated by an American predator to seize the Jin Kim throne. Clara walked to the window of the estate. Below the iron gates, a swarm of news vans had already gathered. Long lenses were pointed at the house like snipers' rifles. "They're calling me a witch, aren't they?" Clara whispered to the empty room. She scrolled further. The comment sections were a cesspool of the rage engine Madam Kim had ignited. Is this a joke? She is old enough to be his mother's mother. Why is a foreigner carrying the JK heir? Our bloodline is being polluted by a miracle that smells like a scam. Guan Jin Kim has lost his mind. This woman is a fossil. The leak was surgical. It included her age, her race, her retired teacher's salary, and, most cruelly, her private medical data. Madam Kim had stripped Clara naked before the world, hoping the shame would send her scurrying back to Georgia. She wanted to prove that Clara was too old and too dark for the bright lights of the Jin Kim legacy. A knock came at the door. It wasn't the polite tap of a maid. It was the heavy, frantic thud of someone who had just seen the world catch fire. Guan burst in, his tie loosened, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He was holding his own phone, which was lighting up with calls from the board of directors. "Clara, don't look at the news," he commanded, rushing to her side. "Too late, Guan," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She held up the tablet. "Your mother has very busy hands. She didn't just tell the world I'm pregnant. She told them I'm a criminal for being alive at 65. "She crossed the line," Guan hissed, his eyes turning a dangerous obsidian black. "She thinks the media belongs to her because she feeds them. She thinks she can use your dignity as a bargaining chip." He took the tablet from her hands and threw it onto the bed. He grabbed his coat, his posture shifting into that of a man about to go to war. "She wanted a scandal," Guan said, his voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. "I'm going to give her an extinction event. Stay inside, Clara. I'm going to pull the plug on every microphone in this city." Clara watched him go, her hand resting on her stomach. The world was screaming that she was a relic, but as the child moved within her, a tiny, defiant heartbeat against the noise of the world, Clara felt a cold, hard resolve take root. "They want a show," Clara whispered to the glass. "Well, let's give them the finale." The headquarters of Seoul Global Media. The tabloid that had first blasted Clara's medical records across the digital world was a hive of frantic energy. They were riding the highest traffic spike in a decade. Editors were already drafting follow-up pieces, digging into Clara's past in Georgia, looking for more dirt to feed the frenzy. The glass doors of the executive floor didn't just open. They seemed to buckle as Guan Jin Kim stormed through. He wasn't followed by lawyers. He was followed by a phalanx of tech auditors and his private security detail. The editor-in-chief, a man named Park who prided himself on uncovering the truth, stood up from his desk with a smirk. "Chairman Kim, here to offer an exclusive interview. We can discuss the unique nature of your companion's condition." Guan didn't stop until he was inches from the man's face. He didn't look like a businessman. He looked like an executioner. You printed private medical records, Guan said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of pure lethality. You used the word relic to describe the woman I love. You weaponized her race and her age to sell digital ads. It's a matter of public interest, Chairman, Park blustered, though his smirk was fading. The heir to JK, Guan interrupted, just bought your parent company. The room went silent. Park's mouth fell open. What? Guan flicked a hand toward his lead auditor. At 9:02 a.m., Jin Kim Holdings completed a hostile takeover of the SGM Group's majority shares. As of 30 seconds ago, I am the sole owner of this building, your servers, and your contracts. Guan leaned over the desk, his shadow swallowing the editor. You're fired. Not just you. The editorial board. Every writer who touched that headline. Every fact-checker who looked at my wife's private records and didn't look away. Security will escort you out. You have 3 minutes to clear your desks. If you take so much as a stapler, I will have you prosecuted for theft of company property. You can't do this, Park screamed, his face turning a panicked shade of purple. This is a violation of press freedom. This is a cleaning service, Guan countered. He turned to the rest of the newsroom, his voice booming so it reached every cubicle. Let this be a signal to every camera lens in Seoul. Clara James is not a story. She is not a foreigner. She is my wife. She is the mother of my child, and she is untouchable. If you mention her name without reverence, if you speculate on her body or her age, I will find out who owns your mortgage, and then I will own it too. He didn't wait for a response. He walked to the main server hub at the center of the floor and pulled a single thick fiber optic cable. The monitors across the room flickered and died. The website, with its hateful headlines and racist comments, went dark. He walked out of the building as the former editorial board was being herded into the elevators by his security team. Outside, the midday sun hit his face, and he pulled out his phone. He didn't call his mother, he called Clara. It's done, he said, his voice softening the moment he heard her breathe. The world is quiet now, Clara, but the board is meeting in an hour. They're trying to use this to take the company. Are you ready to show them what a matriarch looks like? The air in the 50th floor boardroom of the Jin Kim Tower was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and cold, concentrated fear. This was the sanctum of the old guard. 12 men in charcoal suits who controlled the flow of billions. At the head of the table, though she held no official seat, sat Madam Kim. She looked triumphant, her hands folded over a silk clutch, her eyes fixed on the empty chair at the far end of the table. The stock price dropped 4 points this morning, Director Han announced, slamming a tablet onto the mahogany surface. The market hates uncertainty, and a 65-year-old grandmother carrying a miracle heir? It's not uncertainty, it's a circus. It makes the Jin Kim legacy look like a tabloid joke. It's more than the market, another director chimed in, leaning into the light. It's the stability of the succession, a child born to a woman of that vintage, the health risks alone, the optics of the age gap. The shareholders are calling it a delusional lapse in judgment by our CEO. They're demanding Guan step down. Madam Kim allowed a thin, razor-like smile to touch her lips. My son has been compromised. He has fallen prey to a sophisticated predator who understands how to weaponize his desire for a family. We cannot allow the future of Korea's greatest empire to be tied to a woman who will be 80 before the child finishes primary school. It's corporate suicide, Han added. We have the bylaws. Clause 14, moral and mental fitness. We move to strip Guan of his voting rights and appoint a temporary regent. And the American, a younger board member asked. She will be dealt with, Madam Kim said, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. Once Guan is removed from power, she has no protection. She will be deported, and the miracle will become a private legal matter. We are protecting the bloodline from a biological and social catastrophe. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the end of the hall didn't just open. They were flung wide with a force that made the crystal water decanters on the table rattle. Guan entered first, his stride predatory and focused, but he didn't go to his chair. He stepped aside, reaching back to take the hand of the woman behind him. Clara James walked into the lion's den. She wasn't wearing the soft knits of an Atlanta retiree. She was draped in a structured midnight black suit with a brooch of interlocking gold. The Jin Kim family crest pinned firmly to her lapel. She looked every bit the matriarch. Her presence was so commanding that two of the directors instinctively stood up, a reflex of respect they couldn't suppress. "I hear there's a concern about the stock price," Clara said, her voice a calm, resonant bell that cut through the stagnant air. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight to the side of the table opposite Madame Kim, her eyes locking onto the woman who had tried to buy her soul. "And I hear," Clara continued, placing her hand flat on the table, "that some of you think my age is a liability, that my child is a catastrophe. Well, I've spent 40 years managing classrooms of 30 children with fewer resources than this entire building. If you think a boardroom of men in suits intimidates me, you've lived in this bubble far too long." "You have no standing here," Madame Kim shrieked, her composure finally shattering at the sight of the family crest on Clara. "Actually," Guan said, his voice like cracking ice as he stood behind Clara, "she has every standing, because you aren't just looking at my companion. You're looking at the woman who holds the majority of my personal shares. And as of 10 minutes ago, she is my legal proxy." The boardroom went deathly silent. It wasn't just a family drama anymore. It was an invasion. "Now," Clara said, leaning forward until she was eye to eye with Director Han, "shall we talk about the moral fitness of a board that leaks a woman's medical records? Or shall we get down to the business of how I'm going to save your portfolios?" The tension in the boardroom was thick enough to choke the life out of the room. Madame Kim stood, her silver handbox shimmering like the scales of a serpent. She didn't look at her son. She kept her eyes fixed on Clara, her gaze a mixture of desperate loathing and a frantic last-ditch attempt to reclaim her throne. "A proxy?" Madame Kim laughed, a shrill, brittle sound. "You give your power to this American mirage? You all hear him. My son has been drugged by lust, or perhaps the onset of early dementia. He speaks of heirs and miracles from a woman whose body is a graveyard of time." She turned to the board, her voice rising to a theatrical pitch. "Let us speak the truth that everyone in Seoul is thinking, but is too polite to say. A 65-year-old woman does not conceive. It is a biological lie, a scam designed to anchor her to the Jin Kim fortune. She is a fraud, and my son is her victim." Madame Kim slammed a hand onto the mahogany table, pointing a manicured finger at Clara's midsection. "I demand a prenatal paternity test, today, under the supervision of my doctors, not some back alley clinic in Georgia. And until those results are verified, I move that this board declares Guan Jin Kim mentally unfit to lead. No sane man would believe this medical miracle. The age gap is not a romance. It is proof of a psychological breakdown." The directors murmured, their eyes darting between the two women. The age gap was being weaponized as a symptom of insanity. The board was leaning toward her. The logic of the impossible was on Madame Kim's side. Clara felt the weight of the room shifting. She felt the heat of the men's stares, judging her silver hair, the lines at the corners of her eyes, and the history written in her skin. "You want a test?" Clara's voice was a low, steady thrum. She stood up, her movement slow and regal. "You want to talk about sanity and miracles?" She walked around the table, stopping just inches from Madame Kim. Clara was taller, her presence anchored by decades of standing at the front of a classroom, commanding the respect of hundreds. You call me a fraud because you can't fathom a grace that doesn't have a price tag, Clara said. You think God's handiwork needs a permission slip from your board of directors? I'll take your test. I'll take it right now, in front of any doctor you trust. Clara leaned in, her eyes flashing with a terrifying, soulful fire. But understand this, Madam Kim. When that paper comes back and proves that my child, the Jin Kim heir, is exactly who I say he is, you won't be a grandmother. You'll be a stranger. Because I'm going to make sure that the sanity you're so worried about is used to write you out of this family's history forever. Is that a threat? Madam Kim hissed. No, Clara replied, a small, cold smile playing on her lips. That's a promise from a woman who has nothing left to fear from you. Call your doctors. I've got nothing but time, something you seem to be running out of. Guan stepped forward, his hand resting on the back of Clara's chair. You heard her. Call the clinic. But know this, Mother. This is the last time you will ever question the integrity of my wife. When the results are read, this board will not be voting on my fitness. They will be voting on your exile. The air in the boardroom was no longer just tense. It was acidic. 2 hours had passed since the medical team had retreated to the private lab on the 48th floor. The 12 directors sat like statues, their eyes darting toward the door every time a shadow passed the frosted glass. Madam Kim sat at the head of the table, her spine so rigid it looked brittle. She had already drafted the press release for the tragic exposure of the American fraud. The doors didn't just open. They swung wide with a rhythmic, heavy thud. Clara James walked in. She had changed into a tailored suit of cream silk, a color that made her skin look like radiant velvet. She didn't look like a woman under scrutiny. She looked like a woman who had already won. Behind her, Guan walked with the measured stride of a man who had finally shed a skin that didn't fit him. The glares from the board were cold, sharp enough to draw blood, but Clara met every single one of them. She didn't blink. She didn't look down. She walked to the center of the room and stood before the long mahogany table, her presence filling the space until the men in their expensive suits seemed to shrink. Guan stepped to her side. He didn't look at the board. He looked only at Clara, his hand finding hers and interlacing their fingers in a grip that communicated an absolute unbreakable unity. The results are in, Guan announced. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a gavel. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew 2 documents. He didn't hand them to his mother. He tossed them onto the center of the table, where they slid across the polished wood like a challenge. Document 1, Guan said, pointing to the first paper. The prenatal DNA results, verified by 3 independent labs and your own chief of medicine, Mother. The child Clara is carrying is mine, 100%. A biological miracle, yes, but a Jin Kim reality. A low, stunned murmur rippled through the directors. One of them picked up the paper, his hands trembling as he read the markers. Madam Kim's face went a sickly shade of ash. And document 2, Guan continued, his voice growing cold and sharp. Our marriage license, registered this morning at the embassy. Clara isn't a guest or a proxy. She is the CEO's wife. She is the matriarch of this family. And as of this moment, her authority over my shares is permanent. The silence that followed was deafening. The paternity gambit had blown up in Madam Kim's face, leaving her standing in the rubble of her own cruelty. Clara stepped forward, leaning her weight onto the table, her eyes locking onto Madam Kim's. You spent your whole life building a wall of perfection and tradition, Clara said, her southern drawl turning into a steel blade. But you forgot that walls are meant to be broken. You called me a relic? Well, this relic just became the foundation of your son's future, And I think you'll find that I'm much harder to get rid of than a $10 million check. Guan turned to the board, his face a mask of absolute authority. The miracle isn't just that she's pregnant. The miracle is that she's willing to stay in a family that treated her like this. Now, we have a new agenda for this meeting, and it starts with the immediate resignation of the chairperson emeritus. The doors to the grand hall of the Jin Kim Tower were thrown open, and for the first time in the company's history, the private sanctum of the elite was flooded with the white-hot glare of the international press. Guan didn't lead Clara. He walked beside her, their hands still clasped, a living bridge between two worlds that everyone said could never touch. The flashes were a rhythmic staccato, reflecting off the mahogany walls and the stunned, pale faces of the board of directors. Madame Kim stood near the head of the table, her fingers digging into the velvet upholstery of her chair so hard her knuckles turned the color of bone. Guan stepped toward the bank of microphones. He didn't look at the teleprompter. He didn't look at his notes. He looked directly into the primary lens of the national broadcaster. For 72 hours, this city has whispered, Guan began, his voice amplified until it shook the very glass of the skyscraper. You have spoken of tradition. You have whispered about age and suitability. You have allowed anonymous sources to drag a woman's dignity through the mud because she does not fit your narrow definition of a miracle. He reached back, bringing Clara forward until she stood in the center of the frame. She was a vision in cream silk, her silver strand hair shimmering under the lights. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like an answer to a prayer. This woman, Guan said, his voice dropping into a resonant, chest-deep register, is Clara James Kim. She is not a foreigner. She is not an interloper. She is my wife. She is the anchor of my soul. And most importantly, he paused, a hush falling over the room, so absolute you could hear the hum of the cameras. She carries the future of the Jin Kim legacy, a child conceived against every law of science, but by every law of love, my heir. A roar of hushed murmurs broke out, but Guan silenced it with a single, sharp raise of his hand. He turned his head slightly, his gaze raking over the 12 directors who sat trembling in their seats. The board has spent the morning discussing stability, Guan said, his eyes flashing with a cold executive lethality. So let me provide you with the ultimate stability. Any vote against Clara, any move to disinherit this child or disrespect my wife is a vote to lose me as your CEO. If she is not welcomed as the matriarch of this empire, then there is no empire. I will resign. I will take my shares, and I will watch this tower crumble from the porch of our home in Georgia. He leaned into the microphone, his final words a serrated edge. You have 5 minutes to decide if you want a company or if you want to die on the hill of your own prejudice. My wife and I will be waiting in my office. Clara didn't say a word. Behind them, the rage engine of the public began to shift. The sheer audacity of his devotion was doing the impossible. It was turning the scandal into a legend. The silence following Guan and Clara's exit was a vacuum, one that Madame Kim rushed to fill with the sound of her own disintegration. As the elevator doors chimed shut down the hall, the matriarch of the Jin Kim Empire stood frozen behind the mahogany table. The cameras were still rolling. The red, on-air lights of the national news crews pulsed like digital heartbeats, capturing every twitch of her perfecting mask as it finally, irrevocably shattered. Cowards! She shrieked, her voice cracking into a register that had never been heard in these hallowed halls. She slammed her palms onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. You sit there and tremble? You listen to his threats and you bow? Director Han wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his eyes darting toward the live feed monitors. Madam Kim, please, we are life. The global markets? The markets be damned, she roared, lunging toward the nearest camera lens. Her hair, usually a work of structural art, had begun to fray at the temples. Her eyes were bloodshot, wide with a manic, ancestral terror. Look at what he has done. Look at the shame he has brought to the soil of this country. She turned back to the board, her finger shaking as she pointed toward the door where Clara had stood. My son, the golden prince of soul. He chose a 65-year-old Black American over his own mother, over his own blood. Her voice rose to a guttural scream that echoed off the glass walls. He has discarded 5 centuries of lineage for a relic from Georgia. He has chosen a woman who looks like that. A woman who is too old to be a bride and too dark to be a Jin Kim, over the very woman who gave him life. The directors didn't just cringe, they recoiled. A collective shudder passed through the room. In the modern, globalized world of Jin Kim International, racism was no longer just a moral failing. It was a catastrophic financial liability. To hear the matriarch utter such naked, prehistoric vitriol in front of a global audience was the sound of a billion-dollar brand imploding. Madam Kim, Director Han whispered, his voice trembling with a new kind of fear. You are destroying everything. I am saving it, she cried, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hate. She is a stain. She is a shadow on our son. How can you stand there and accept a miracle that comes in that skin? How can you... Enough, Han shouted, finally standing. He looked at the technician in the back. Cut the feed, now! But it was too late. The clip was already viral. From Seoul to New York to London, the world had seen the face of the Jin Kim matriarch, and it was the face of a dying era. The rage she had built to destroy Clara had backfired. The public wasn't angry at the elderly foreigner anymore. They were horrified by the monster in the silver hanbok. Madam Kim sank into her chair, her breath coming in ragged, ugly gasps. She looked around the table, seeking an ally, but she found only the cold, calculating eyes of men who had already decided she was a write-off. She had tried to use the age gap and the race gap as a gasoline fire to burn Clara out. Instead, she had only managed to incinerate herself. The boardroom was silent, but it was the silence of a vacuum following a massive explosion. The digital screens around the room still flickered with the frozen image of Madam Kim's distorted face, a permanent record of the moment she had traded her legacy for a handful of hate. Guan re-entered the room. He didn't look at the cameras, and he didn't look at the board. He walked straight to the head of the table where his mother sat, slumped in her chair like a queen who had just watched her castle turn to sand. The bylaws of Jin Kim International are very specific regarding the conduct of its leadership, Guan said, his voice flat, devoid of the heat that had defined the morning. He tapped a glass-top tablet on the table, and a document appeared on the main monitors. Resolution for the removal of Chairperson Emeritus. Guan, Madam Kim whispered, her voice cracking. I am your mother. In this room, you are a shareholder whose behavior has caused a 5% dip in our market cap in under 20 minutes, Guan countered. You have turned our brand into a synonym for bigotry. You have attacked the wife of the CEO and the future heir of this company. He looked around the table. The directors, once terrified of the woman in silver, now looked at her as if she were a faulty piece of equipment. I move to strip Madame Kim of all honorary titles, all voting rights, and her seat on the philanthropic board, effective immediately, Guan announced. I have the majority of the family shares. Directors, how do you vote? One by one, the hands went up. It was a rhythmic, silent execution. Director Han was the last. He didn't even look at her as he raised his hand. The motion carries. Madam Kim stood, her eyes darting around the room, searching for the loyalty she thought she had bought with decades of fear. You can't do this. I built this. I protected this bloodline. The bloodline is moving forward, Guan said. You are staying here. He raised a hand, and the heavy doors opened. 2 security guards stepped inside, the same men who had intercepted Clara at the airport, the men who had been Madam Kim's personal shadow for years. "Escort the former chairperson from the building," Guan commanded. "See that she is taken to the secondary estate in Jeju. She is no longer permitted on corporate grounds or at the primary residence without my written consent." "You would send me away?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the glass. "With these men? My own men?" The lead guard, a man who had seen the way Madam Kim looked at Clara, stepped forward. He didn't bow. He simply took her by the elbow with a firm, clinical grip. "This way, madam," he said. The walk of shame was long. As she was led out, she had to pass the monitors showing the news, where the rage engine was now being fueled by her own words. She was escorted past the secretaries who had feared her, past the janitors she had ignored, and finally into the same black sedan she had used as a cage for Clara. Guan stood at the window watching the car pull away. He felt a hand on his shoulder. Clara was there, her touch grounding him, her presence a reminder of why the war had been fought. "Is it over?" she asked softly. "The old world is gone, Clara," he said, turning to her. "Now we have to build the new one." The following Monday, the atmosphere in the Jin Kim Tower had shifted from a battlefield to a cathedral. The jagged glass and cold marble remained, but the spirit of the building was beginning to thaw. Guan stood at the head of the conference table, his hand resting on the back of the high-backed chair that had sat empty since his father's passing. It was the chairman's throne, a seat traditionally reserved for the most powerful voice in the room. Beside it, he had placed a new chair, one of deep mahogany and soft dark leather. "Gentlemen," Guan began, his voice steady and resonant, "the Jin Kim legacy has always been about more than shipping lanes and silicon chips. It was founded on the idea of serving the people. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. We became a fortress instead of a bridge." He turned to the door. Clara walked in, draped in a suit of pearl gray silk. She wore a single piece of jewelry, a vintage brooch of a phoenix, a gift Guan had found for her to symbolize her rise from the ashes of the previous week. "I am officially announcing the appointment of Clara James Kim as the chairperson of the Jin Kim International Foundation," Guan declared. "She will oversee our global philanthropic efforts, commanding a $10 billion endowment. Furthermore, she will serve as a permanent board advisor with full veto power on all matters concerning corporate ethics and social responsibility." A few directors shifted in their seats. This wasn't just a title, it was a transfer of the keys to the empire. By giving her control over the foundation and ethics, Guan had made Clara the moral compass of the company. Clara didn't sit immediately. She walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling city of Seoul. "For 40 years, she said, her voice carrying that quiet schoolteacher authority that demanded attention, "I taught children that their history wasn't a cage, but a foundation. I've seen what happens when power is used to diminish people instead of lifting them up." She turned back to the room, her gaze resting on each director. "I am 65 years old. I'm a Black woman from the American South, and I am carrying the next generation of this company. I didn't come here to be a figurehead. I came here to ensure that when my child sits in one of these chairs, they inherit a company that is known for its heart, not just its bank account." She sat down. It wasn't just a seat, it was a throne. "Now," Clara said, opening a leather-bound folder, "let's discuss the labor conditions at the Busan shipyard. I believe we can do better." Guan watched her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He hadn't just saved his relationship, he had saved his legacy. He had brought a queen to Seoul, and she was already rewriting the laws of the land. 6 months later. The evening air at the Jin Kim estate no longer felt sharp or exclusionary. It had softened into a gentle breeze that carried the scent of the cherry blossoms and the distant rhythmic hum of a city that had finally learned to whisper her name with respect. Clara stood on the wide white marble balcony of the master suite, her hands resting naturally over the swell of her stomach. At 65, she had expected her life to be a quiet series of sunsets. She never imagined she would be standing at the helm of an empire, watching the sun dip below the Han River as the matriarch of a dynasty. The miracle kicked, a small, sharp reminder of life that science said shouldn't exist. Clara smiled, a deep, soulful expression that smoothed the lines of the week's battles. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she felt the familiar, grounding warmth of Guan. He pressed his face into the curve of her neck, breathing her in. The scent of Georgia jasmine and the resilience of a woman who had stood against a storm and won. The board just sent over the final reports for the new scholarship fund, Guan whispered, his voice vibrating with a peace she hadn't heard since they were in Atlanta. They're calling it the James Kim Initiative. They're terrified of you, you know. Good, Clara chuckled, leaning back into him. A little healthy fear keeps the soul honest. Besides, I think they're more afraid of the fact that I actually read the fine print. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the city lights flicker on like a carpet of diamonds. The rage engine of his mother's making had burned itself out, leaving Madame Kim in a gilded exile where she could no longer touch the future. The socialites had retreated, the media had been tamed, and the board had been broken and rebuilt. Do you regret it? Guan asked softly, his hand moving to cover hers on her stomach. Coming here? Facing all that ugliness? Clara turned in his arms, her eyes reflecting the gold and violet of the twilight. She looked at the man who had hidden his crown to find his heart, and then at the belly that held the impossible. I've spent my life telling my students that the hardest paths lead to the best views, she said, reaching up to brush a stray hair from his forehead. This view? It's the best one I've ever seen. No, Guan, I don't regret a single second. She looked back out at the empire. She wasn't just a wife, and she wasn't just a mother-to-be. She was the queen of a new era, one where age was a badge of wisdom, where race was a thread in a richer tapestry, and where miracles didn't check birth certificates before they arrived. As the last sliver of the sun vanished, the lights of the Jin Kim Tower pierced the dark, glowing brighter than ever before. Clara James Kim took a deep breath of the soul air, felt the heartbeat of her child against her palm, and finally truly took her seat. The halls of the Jin Kim Medical Center, the most advanced facility in Asia, were silent, but it was the silence of a kingdom holding its breath. For the first time in its history, the top floor had been cleared not for a political summit, but for a birth that the world had dubbed the Soul Miracle. Inside the royal suite, the air was warm and smelled of lavender and Georgia pine. Clara lay against a mountain of pillows, her face gleaming with sweat and a transcendental sort of exhaustion. At 65, she had labored with the grit of a woman who knew that pain was just the precursor to a masterpiece. Guan had not left her side for a single second. His suit jacket was gone, his sleeves were rolled up, and his eyes were fixed on the small, bundled miracle in Clara's arms. He looks just like you, Guan whispered, his voice thick with an emotion that no amount of wealth could buy. Clara looked down at the infant. He was a beautiful, toasted almond hue, with a shock of thick black hair and the unmistakable, stubborn set of the Jin Kim jaw. He was healthy, robust, and loud. A tiny titan who had defied every biological clock and social barrier to be here. He looks like a new beginning, Clara corrected softly. She ran a finger over the baby's velvet cheek. Welcome to the world, Arthur Guan Jin Kim. You've got a lot of people to prove wrong. As if on cue, a soft chime sounded at the door. It wasn't a doctor or a nurse. It was the lead of the board of directors, Director Han, carrying a silver tray. He entered with a deep, respectful bow, not just to the CEO, but to the matriarch. "The markets have just opened," Han said, his voice hushed. When the news of the birth was confirmed, the Jin Kim stock hit an all-time high. "The world isn't just watching, Mrs. Jin Kim. They are celebrating." He placed the tray on the table. On it lay a small, handcrafted box, a gift from the board, a set of traditional gold longevity rings for the heir, and a message: "The Empire is ready for his arrival." Clara nodded toward him, her dignity as sharp as ever. "Thank you, Director. Ensure the staff is given a week's bonus. We want everyone to share in this joy." As Han bowed his way out, Clara looked out the floor-to-ceiling window. In the distance, the digital billboards of Seoul were flashing a simple, elegant message in both Korean and English: "Welcome, little prince." Far away, in a quiet villa in Jeju, Madam Kim sat in a garden she could not leave, watching the same news on a small screen, a silent ghost of a past that no longer mattered. Clara felt the weight of the baby in her arms and the strength of Guan's hand in hers. She had come to Seoul as an impossible secret, but she had become the foundation of a legacy. "You know," Clara whispered as the baby drifted off to sleep, "my mother always said that when God wants to change the world, he starts with something small." Guan kissed her forehead, then leaned down to kiss the crown of his son's head. "He changed my world the moment I met you, Clara. The rest of the world was just catching up." The sun rose over Seoul, casting a golden light over the tower, the empire, and the woman who had conquered it all simply by refusing to believe in the word impossible. The end. Thank you for watching. If you love this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.